how using the term rainbow can feel a little bit like wearing rose-tinted glasses, that it makes it all seem really nice and rosy, and being a queer person is very happy when that isn't our experience all the time, and that we don't need to kind of engage in toxic positivity just because so much of being queer can be difficult.
Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society podcast. Have you ever come across something and thought, I'm not smart enough for this? We think the fault lies with those who present information in ways which are hard to understand. In an attempt to change this, we'll be speaking to researchers, experts, and all-round wrinkly-brained individuals, improving our understanding of a broad range of topics which are rooted in psychology. Join us as we try to develop ourselves one brain fold at a time.
Please note that the Smooth Brain Society podcast is distinct from the Herenga Waka-Victoria University of Wellington. The views expressed on this show are those of our guests, presenters, and affiliates alone, and we assume no liability for the application of the information discussed. We also take no responsibility for any change in brain folds on part of the audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Now on to the podcast. Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society. We are still off recording for what we'd say would be season 2, I guess. I hate calling them seasons, but sure. But we have a really special episode for you guys today. And as you've seen, most of the podcasts have started off with some quote. And I have picked an Arabic quote for this one. As al-dawi al-khabrat badlan min al-mutalimin. I think that was right. Which means ask the experienced rather than the educated. And I thought it would be ideal for this because
we're neither. Because we aren't any of them.
I think we can let the audience decide. And that was the voice of Clare Bradley, one of the guests here with us today. And I think she would be a good place to start. And is it she?
Yeah.
Can
you imagine it?
Great! That would have been a great way to start.
Cancels are here.
This is not going well already. It's only
do you want to start it over?
Nah. Okay. We'll keep it like this.
You should have known that I was going to spend the whole time bullying you.
Fair enough. All right. So considering this is going to be an episode on queering in psychology. Was that the term you guys wanted to go with?
Yep.
Yes?
Yeah.
No? Maybe?
Yeah.
Right. And also, I guess, partially bullying me. Welcome, everyone, to the episode. I'll let you guys go around and introduce yourselves. Let's start off with Claire, because she decided to butt in midway through the intro.
I shouldn't have interrupted. Hi, everyone. My name is Clare Bradley. I'm allowed to bully Sahir because I am, in fact, one of his research partners. And we've been working together for about a year and a half now on one project that became several kind of neuroscience research projects. Real science projects, as I'm sure will be hotly debated over the course of this episode. And I identify as gay or queer or whatever you would prefer to call it. So, yeah, happy to be here.
Shall we go around to the right then?
Sure. Hi, I am Lee Bravestone. I use they, them pronouns. I am over in Matt Hammond's relationships lab doing some research on sexism and how that applies to queer communities.
Kia ora, malo elele, no taranaki, opotiki me Tonga aho, koe kulele mai me whatai la kepa hihifo, ko hoku ingoa, ko Tatyana, King-Finau. So hello, I'm Tatyana. I'm a baby PhD student in the School of Psychology and have also recently started my clinical psych training. Yeah, that's me.
Kia ora, my name's Maggie. I use they, them pronouns. Just finishing up my honours this week. And I've been volunteering in Mark Wilson's lab for about 4 years and was a queer youth worker for about 7 years as well.
Kia ora koutou, ko Gloria tōku ingoa. I'm Gloria, I use she, her pronouns. My whakapapa connections are to Kaitahu and Te Waipounamu. and I work in the school as a teaching and research fellow. My previous research is in rainbow experiences of accessing mental health support, so that's why I'm here, but I also bring a staff voice, and I'm also straight and cis, so I'm an outsider to the queer community.
All right. Usually we start with we start off with research and how everybody's stories into how they got into the research they do and what life experiences influenced that. So we could start off with that, and we can start off with Claire again, and we can, ask questions, jump in whenever people want, and go from there.
I actually think my story is pretty cliche. I was doing a book report and happened to pick up Oliver Sacks' Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And I loved it so much that I decided then and there that I wanted to do something impressive with my life. And then I decided later to follow Oliver Sacks and do neuroscience. I should have introduced myself as a master's student earlier, but I've wriggled my way into a master's degree studying alcoholism, which is I've always been interested in, the subject of addiction broadly, but there was a free project in the lab that Zahir and I both work in, and I decided it would be really interesting and jumped on it. And I've never left.
And you'll be here for a few more years.
Yeah, a long way to go yet. But so my interests have always kind of settled with the brain in some capacity. So it was only natural for me to do that and stay as far away from my own identity as possible.
So what are you doing here then?
I thought eventually it might be time. Well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting opportunity to actually get to talk about my identity in a way that I wouldn't normally in my research, because they're so distinct and so separate. My personal life is quite different from what I write about, and certainly any time that I spend in the lab. So yeah, it's quite interesting to be talking to other queer people who are actually educated in queer people. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. You said your cliched story, and that's exactly the same story which Matt Hammond said when he was on here. And so and it's only fitting that we ask Lee next, because they are from Matt Hammond's lab.
Yep. So my story is a bit more meandering. I'm actually older than some of the other people here. I'm in my 30s. I had a previous career as a teacher, teaching social studies and theater. And in doing some of that, the parts of teaching I really liked were the connections I formed with individual people, and also kind of bringing in the activism work I'd done within the queer community since I was 16. And so when I moved here to New Zealand from the US, I couldn't bring my qualifications with me. And since I had to go to university anyway, I decided to do a career change. And when I was starting honors, Matt Hammond had just been a co-author on a paper looking at the ambivalent sexism inventory and how there was variance in that scale when you separate out straight and queer people. And so I wanted to play with the data that was there. And so that's kind of how I've gotten into my specific brand of research.
Interesting that you describe it as a brand.
I'm going to make it a brand. It's going to be a PhD now, so.
American.
Lee's thesis TM.
Yes.
Yeah, copyright your own thesis.
Could you tell what parts of the scale actually showed up to be different?
Sure. So what happened, and this is not my specific research, this is cross 2021. So what they did was they had equal groups of straight men, straight women, gay men, and lesbian women. And when they separated those, they did fancy statistics. I am more of a qualitative researcher, so I'm going to be a little out of my depth on this piece. But what they showed was that they started at different points on the scale for the ambivalent sexism scale. And so because they start at different points, they're not interacting with the scale at the same way. What my research did is went and looked at a qualitative question of why is that happening? And kind of an obvious thing when you actually look at some of the questions are things like a man is incomplete without the love of a woman. If you're queer, that doesn't make any sense to your life. And so really queer people can't even interact with the scale at that basic level. So it's just not their life experience.
So are you trying to then make a new scale
Yep, that's the PhD project that I'm pitching right now and will hopefully be starting in February, is to, first of all, learn more about what does sexism look like for queer people, because there's no research on it right now. There's a lot of things connecting it back to heteronormativity, heterosexism, but nothing about what is queer sexism as carried out and endorsed by queer people. So we're going to start with that, and then taking that information, build a new, more inclusive scale, and trying to build in some kind of intersectionality into that scale.
It's pretty cool.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Audience reaction.
So should we move on to Tatyana then?
Sure. So I think my foray into psychology was through like growing up in like a few different countries. I was really lucky to have like spent some time in the Kingdom of Tonga. So that's I whakapapa to Tonga on dad's side. Fiji, the Turks and Caicos Islands. So that's like near where they film Pirates of the Caribbean. Singapore before moving back home to Aotearoa for college. And I think like just hearing so many different people's like backgrounds and stories and experiences, I think throughout the way it was just it was interesting being like, oh right, okay, that's why you think that way, because like, you know, that was the norm growing up or whatever. I think that got me really interested in how people think and kind of interact with the world. And I guess my specific, in terms of like my kind of queer research, I did my honors in looking at kind of the role of family support for Māori and Pasifika rainbow communities. And I think it was just I really wanted to incorporate the kind of like, you know, what are our kind of core values, and whānau and family is huge. And it was funny because I didn't know. I was like, I know I want to do something with Māori and Pasifika. I'm just not sure what. And I was talking with my mom, and it was actually my mom that was like, hey, have you thought about like, you know, I haven't really seen anything about our rainbow communities. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, yeah. So shout outs to mom. And so, that's kind of taken me onto this path where I am now, where I get to kind of surround myself with like Indigenous methodologies, like looking at how things were in the past, like pre-colonization and before the missionaries kind of spread through the islands. And it's just been really cool connecting in with the past and like my ancestors in Tipuna like that. So what I'm actually looking at the moment is kind of like what fills the cups of our Takatapui, MVPFAFF plus rainbow communities, and like kind of what Indigenous queer joy looks like.
That's really cool. From what you've researched so far, could you tell any general basic differences which you've seen in terms of like how maybe pre or post colonization, how they've looked like?
I think so. For my PhD at the moment, it's just kind of been looking at like what like literature exists out there, like what resources exist already. A huge thing would be those kind of internalized values that came with colonization. So that's, you know, heteronormativity, like very binary gender roles, which wasn't really the case beforehand. Like if we look at the amazing Elizabeth Kerekele's work, and when she was looking through Whakatoki and was picking out that there were men and women were equal and had like really important roles to play. And, you know, it was quite common for people to have like multiple partners. So polyamory was also kind of a more normalized thing, as well as, there were, there are some iwi that that don't use the term takatapui or hadn't used it because there wasn't a term, like you just were, like people could just, be who they were. So I think it's really exciting to try and, like kamua, kamuri, like how can we walk backwards into the future and bring that kind of thing, with us.
That sounds really interesting, kind of a society without need for any kind of labelling. I think that's like I I know that this is contentious, but that would be a really interesting attitude to bring back into kind of a post-colonial society, especially in the queer community, who kind of, at this point, I know that there are some people that are really almost meticulous with labelling identity, and then there are some people who love to take a step back. Really interesting.
And then I guess the more divisions you make, the more specific the divisions have to become each time, and then you just make more divisions.
Well, it's a hornet's nest in the queer community about what labels are valid or appropriate, and kind of which are splitting hairs.
Well, and then it creates infighting within the group too, which doesn't benefit the queer community, but it does benefit majority communities, which is a problem all minorities, I think, have. At some point, infighting starts breaking out.
Yeah. And I guess that's sometimes a sign of progress, which can be a good thing, but it's certainly not helpful.
Yeah.
Maggie.
I guess the major driver of most of the things that I do, especially like youth work, was wanting to make a difference in my community. So I spent sort of 9 years in youth work, 7 particularly in the rainbow community, because I wanted to make a difference and push for sort of improvements in certain areas. And the same sort of applies for my research as well. So in 2017, I think it was 2017, I was kicked out of university for unsatisfactory grades, and that kind of led to me getting a diagnosis of ADHD with the psych clinic. And it was sort of the following months after I was diagnosed and looking into research in New Zealand, and looking at research in general, and just seeing how strongly deficit-based it was, and sort of the major gap in New Zealand especially, and just sort of feeling the effect of that research not only on myself but other people, and saying, I could actually change that and make a difference. Because I guess previously with my degree I had sort of been floundering around, and I knew I had to get a degree but I didn't really have a drive. And it was only until that moment that I knew what I needed to do. And so sort of everything has been working up to that point, sort of being able to do that research and being able to reflect my community in a way that isn't just saying that, we're these horrible people with, all of these things wrong with us, or saying that we're these extremely gifted savants or whatever, but just having a holistic sort of representation of people like myself. So yeah, that's sort of what I've been working up to.
Have you thought about looking at that intersection between kind of ADHD and the queer community? Because I know there's quite a bit of overlap.
There is, yeah. And I've had quite a few conversations with various people about that. And I think that would sort of be reflected in the research that I do, just by collecting that kind of data. But I think what we need at the moment is just data in general. And then I'd love to do, research in the future that looks at that, because, you're right, there is quite a big intersection. And I remember sort of talking to Gloria about it when I was helping code her data. And I was trying to sort of figure out why that was. And I think you said something around the lines of, neurodiverse people are sort of unbounded by these strict gender norms, and we're sort of more free to express ourselves, especially with gender, because we just see the world differently and we're not held by those same social norms. I'm not sure if you want to talk to that at all.
I mean, it's one theory, yeah. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, what you said made a lot of sense, but I think there would definitely be nuances to it that I don't sort of really know at this point. But I think the research would be incredibly valuable. Just, you know, with like research, and this won't be a surprise to anyone, people within minority groups kind of get lumped into this homogenous group. But if we were able to do this kind of research, you would be able to reflect the different experiences within sort of the ADHD community. So I think that would be really valuable, but just need to actually get accepted into the PhD program first.
Yeah.
And
So
then,
we and all of the listeners are crossing fingers,
thank you.
crossing toes, cross your cat's paws.
I do wonder if that creates, if there's like a chicken and egg scenario there, because we see a lot of stuff in our lab between the overlap of psychopathology and all kinds of neurodiversity and what's the word? I'm so trying to stop myself from saying alternative. From like, you know, queer identity and kind of, I suppose, non-normative is far too clinical a word, but we see like quite this big overlap between, you know, there's, for example, the autistic community and being queer and also depression and anxiety, and it does, I do wonder if there is a chicken and egg situation there, because I'm sure for a lot of people being queer or, you know, having maybe, you know, a minority sexuality or gender identity creates, I'm sure, a lot of stress and anxiety or depression in of itself, but perhaps as well, I liked that idea that maybe some neurodiverse people are just kind of prone to exploring themselves kind of unburdened by social norms.
And possibly just being more introspective in general, right? Like if you have been on a journey of understanding yourself, because, you know, we live in a heteronormative, cis-normative world, and kind of going, hey, I don't think that that's me, and so you're doing all of this identity work, then it also kind of makes sense that you'd look for other explanatory frameworks, say, of why am I the way I am.
Well, especially because you can't take some of those things for granted the way that other people can. And this actually does surface in some of the sexism work of, you know, being high in sexism can actually be beneficial for some people if they don't question those things. If this is just how you see the world, and so you live, that's how you see the world, that can have benefits to anxiety, to depression. But once you start questioning those things, and now you can't rely on this framework society has given you, then you have some kind of short-term detriments in those things, but then long term, over time, we see gains coming back. So it's kind of this ignorance is bliss playing out in the research.
Yeah, I suppose as well, a lot of like neurodivergent people already have to do this, like you said, all of this introspection. I think maybe the attitude is, while I'm here, you know, while I'm in this place mentally, maybe I'll just have a quick gander into my identity, you know, outside of being neurodiverse.
I guess one thing that I was sort of reminded sort of relates to your question of me conducting that kind of research is with the chicken or egg question, it could easily be utilised by like TERFs, for example, so trans exclusionary radical feminists, with ideas of what especially gender diverse people are. That's sort of why I'm also hesitant to go down that route, is because like it could be really valuable research, and you know, you could have the best intentions, but when you kind of look into that kind of stuff, it could easily be sort of weaponized, especially sort of looking at gender diverse people, and then it sort of leads to neurodiversity.
And that kind of fear of somebody quote unquote curing it because now we figured out what the biological mechanism might be.
That's that becomes a very interesting philosophical question, doesn't it? Because at a certain point, research can always be used for harm. It has been in the past, and it can/will be in the future. And then you also get into the burden of guilt of knowledge. If you know something and you don't use it, then you're getting into another questioning route, isn't it? Especially if you know, example, if you know or if you had like a blood pattern which figured out that, okay, this person's 90% likely to get depressed later on in life for whatever reasons, do you then try to alter them as a child, or do you not? Yeah.
Whole dystopian novels written to answer that question.
Yeah, but the truth is, the more you research, the more we know about these things, and then there's a tipping point, isn't there?
Well, there's that, people love to throw around facts don't care about your feelings, but facts can be used to hurt your feelings. And so I think it's interesting that you brought up, Maggie, that like it's this catch-22 of like, this is valuable research and it's investigating a really important question, but maybe outside the community, it might confirm some stereotypes or prejudices that people might have who perhaps aren't willing to engage with the research or investigate the community thoroughly enough to actually gain some insight. Which is probably, I think everyone in this room is kind of part of this echo chamber of academics swapping stories and information and stuff, and I think sometimes it's worth taking a step back and being like, oh my god, if people were to enter these conversations, they'd probably think we're all nutters.
Well, speaking of academics, as the staff...
I thought you were going to be like, speaking of nutters.
Segue. Gloria, what are your thoughts?
So what do you want to know? How I came to do what I do? I went into psychology pretty naive. I kind of did it because I'm a people person. I like people. And luckily I fell in love with it. I just sort of really loved it from day one. And at the same time that I was doing undergrad psychology, I was really involved in feminist communities and activism. And feminist activism has a really big overlap with queer activism. So I was, I guess, thinking a lot about gender and thinking about, women's spaces and protecting women. And people were asking me, does your feminism include all women? And so that got me thinking a lot about gender and sexuality. And then when I started doing my clinical training, I realised that we weren't talking about gender or sexuality, and that seemed like a real gap for me. So I had a look into the research on rainbow people's experiences in therapy, and there wasn't much there. And so I thought that would be a really valuable project to think about how we could make it better. And I liked your beautiful quote that you started off with about listening to those with experience, not those educated, because I think I'd probably fall into the educated camp, and I think that we could be listening to academics actually a whole lot less. Like, I have a real problem with this kind of hierarchy we have of people with PhDs being all-knowing and all-powerful, because I think about, our staff in the School of Psychology, and they're a great bunch of people, but like, where is the rainbow representation there?
Yeah, I was literally going to ask. Everybody here is a student,
except for me. Yeah. And so I think that's really problematic. I look around at the students, and you're all doing really cool work, and all have lots to say and lots of really valuable things to say, and it's not the kind of stuff I hear echoed through staff meetings. So I guess my questions are about how we get our staff more in touch with the important stuff, and how we actually get more diverse representation among our staff.
I don't have stats on me, unfortunately, but I can't see it being very different in other universities either, unless anybody knows around the world.
I think our School of Psychology is, which is not to say we don't have rainbow staff members, we do, but when we did our Queering Psychology event a couple of weeks ago, we really wanted a staff member on that panel to come and speak about what it's like to be rainbow in academia, and didn't have any luck finding anyone, and I just thought that was really striking. And I do know that in other psychology departments, there are many more visible rainbow people who are, I guess, kind of saying to rainbow students, like, you can see yourself in me. Yeah, I don't know, what is it like for you all to not have that?
I personally went to a different school to find that. So I'm really good friends with someone over in the School of Health who is openly queer, does queer research, and so we have lunches and hang out to kind of have that side of that mentorship, because the people I work with in the School of Psychology, I don't know anybody who is openly queer. Really great allies, and that credit is definitely deserved and needs a shout out itself, but there's no one I could go to be like, this is what it's like to be queer in this space, what it's like to be apparent in this space, all of those different identities that I bring into my work, whereas that's one person that I can go to who has very similar experiences.
I think there is a slight difference between, like, as you said, you had to go outside of psychology, but my educational background is in biology as well as psych, so once you get into third year, so you've weeded out all the people who, aren't gonna kind of stick around for a whole degree, that you've only really got the people who really want to be there left. The demographics, the people who are left are really, really interesting, fascinating people watching. Like in psychology, most people are still kind of really functional human beings in society, and they do normal things. But in like biology and chemistry and physics, you've got the people who pursue those long term are often people that do not give a fuck about what anyone else thinks of them, about what they look like, about how they talk or act. And I mean this very lovingly, because I'm still friends with quite a number of the academics and students in the biology department. But I think there's quite a difference in attitude between departments. Like the biology attitude towards queer people, I think is, I don't know, but I can't see them hosting a queer panel. But at the same time, I almost feel that they wouldn't need to, because there are so many people in biology that are they're just strange and in a wonderful way.
Well, I wonder if part of that comes from that really strong positivist outlook on what they do, where again, you do feel like you're very, very separate from your researcher identity, and what you do is not the same. Whereas in psychology, we have more of a blend and a spectrum from that positive all the way out to critical theory, critical realism, whatever you want to get on the other side, if it's sides even.
Let's start a war.
Yeah, there we go.
Let's create conflict on this podcast.
Yeah. But I'm just saying, like, because psych kind of does have these different factions, and we talk about the school of psych like it's one body, but even that's fairly heterogeneous between the kind of neuropsych people, the qualitative researchers, the social psychologists, the cultural psychologists. Like, it's all over the place. But we're all kind of in this weird nebulous umbrella of psychology. And even that is at this intersection of social science and hard science and health, and like, where do we fit?
I do think that there's like something to be said for psychology being a very popular subject. So pop psychology is massive in the general public and the real world. You think of how many bookshops have, sections set up to kind of psychology tables and stuff. So I think like all of us in this room are researching things that are very accessible and really cool to talk about. And then you go to chemistry and biology, and like you meet one person who's like, I've spent my whole life studying algae, and I wouldn't change it for the world, and like, you find these people who have found their niche, no pun intended, and like it's almost like, I think there are fields in the hard sciences that kind of reward neurodiversity and special interests and stuff, because people get to do these bizarre things and love it. So like, I think maybe there are some, and my point there is that there's a huge difference in departments.
Good segue, I guess. So what I'm curious about, because we've been talking about like differences in departments, because Tatyana, you came from University of Otago.
I did.
I'm curious as to the difference between sort of the University of Otago, although you did undergrad there, right?
Yeah, I did my undergrad honours. Yeah, there. I think the psych department there at Otago, there are visibly queer lecturers, and I think that really comes through strongly in the health psychology kind of department that's down there. And so that's also interestingly that you said that it's in the School of Health that you found someone who can be that kind of mentor in terms of a queer academic. And I don't know, I think it is kind of interesting because I feel like psychology in general attracts interesting people. So I think for us here at Vic, within Pōneke, which is such a super diverse, creative, vibrant, I think it's interesting that, why don't we have more visibly queer people within our department? And so I think, maybe there's, kind of like what Gloria touched on in terms of having, I guess, staff kind of be a little bit more queer competent, or but then also, how do we kind of shift the culture around talking about this stuff and normalizing this stuff. And especially given the city that we're in, that attracts so many I think all walks of life here. That's definitely why I moved here, is because you just have to, and several people have told me this, you just have to go down Cuba Street and just people watch, and just I love that people can just be who they are here, which sorry, I don't think I'm not. I think we went on a journey. With that one.
No, I hear what you're saying, though. That's what attracted me and my partner to moving to Wellington as well. Especially when we were leaving the States, we were trying to find a space that was safer for us as queer people, because things in the States were getting scary and have gotten more scary since that. And so, I think it is really surprising that of the universities here, that Wellington does seem to struggle the most, or Victoria seems to struggle the most with some of those diversity things. And then we have these conversations that happen with certain lecturers, with certain people, and only certain parts of the department will show up. But there's nothing department-wide making this a value. So there's let's have all of the staff go through some sort of a competency training, learn about what pronouns are, so that you're not emailing your students like I did to ask them what a pronoun is and how that signifies your identity, which was a big problem and continues to be a problem with certain lecturers. Or talking about, we need to stop teaching gender as a binary categorical stat when we're teaching stats. There are other things you could do. And so not having to push forth these very anti-queer ideas, but that comes from higher up. That's not something the students can do, because we're also much more temporary than the staff are. We're only here for most people, maybe 3 years. And the longer you stick around, the more you see how these things become systemic issues, and there just isn't much power for students to change them.
I do think that has something to do with Vic as a whole, not just the School of Psychology. Every university has its own reputation and has its own core values. And I think Vic prides itself on being, the serious university, because we do law, and, we're famous for the arts, the art, kind of more classical subjects. And, law is a big attraction to Vic. But then you have, down in Otago, it's medicine, and up in Auckland, it's neuroscience, and Massey is engineering and architecture and all of this stuff. And I think maybe that does put some, before they've even entered the university, that probably puts some queer people off, because they're Vic seems maybe a bit snobby, and it is, and maybe that might be one reason that we're not getting very much queer representation kind of filtering through into staff and postgrad, because of some of the attitudes that are just kind of present from the get-go at this university.
It's also very profit-driven.
Yeah.
People understand diversity and inclusion is not profitable.
No. We've both just been to the strike, haven't we?
Yeah. Even though it actually is profitable, which probably isn't the argument that any of us would make as to why we value it. But we know that you pitch your arguments differently depending on your audience, right? And actually when people are happy and included and well, they actually work harder and produce more. So I think there's something there as well that... I think there is definitely in psychology a stereotype that rainbow research or this kind of research isn't, as citable, as, generalizable, as widespread as this and that. And so there's also a big old intersect with the kind of research that we value.
I find the generalizability argument a bit funny, because what % of the population would consider themselves part of the rainbow community in some way? 15%? 10 to 15?
10 to 15.
10 to 15% of say 7 billion people around the world is a lot of people.
And
Like,
it's growing.
Yeah.
Because that's not a stagnant thing, because we are trying to measure these things as society's also becoming more accepting of these things, it's very likely that figure is bigger. And some of it too is with new generations, they're coming to these concepts of sexuality and gender with a much more kind of nebulous philosophical thing of maybe rejecting some of those labels, that it could eventually get to this point of that number balloons out astronomically.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen that in my clinical work with young people, like asking people, how would you describe your sexuality or gender, and kind of being met with this funny look that goes, why are you always asking me to label this? You know, why do you always want to be putting me in a box? So I think that is sort of on the rise as well, right? This, do I need to categorize myself?
Well, that's, I think, I was just, going to say, I think one of the reasons maybe you were unable to find a queer member of staff to join the panel could have been simply a generational difference in the way that we talk about our identity, right? There might be people who are very openly queer amongst our staff and kind of long-term students, but I think, now I'm personally right on the cusp of millennial and Gen Z. I fit in neither category. And
You won't be labelled.
I will not be labelled as directionless identity. But they, I think Gen Z is like so vocal about like what they identify as and what that means to them. And that because people are talking about how insufferable it is. So it must be, it's filtering through all the way up to kind of mainstream ideas now into in the sort of public consciousness. Whereas I think, people of like my parents' generation or even people maybe 10, 15 years older than me would probably have a very different attitude towards maybe the safety of coming out and speaking publicly about something.
And I think it's safety, and I think it's also not wanting to be boxed into being a queer academic and that being all that you do. And I think, you've talked about this, Claire, being a queer academic who doesn't do queer stuff, and that just because you're queer, it doesn't mean that has to be what dictates your research. And so I think that there are some academics who are rightfully wary of not wanting to be the token rainbow staff member who's put on all the panels about rainbow staff, or who does this or does that, and they just want to get on and do their work. And I think that's really valid. I think it also speaks to the need to have multiple rainbow members of staff, some of who do want to be more visible, others who prefer not to be at work, and that's cool. In the same way that we need Māori staff who do Māori stuff, and then we also need Māori staff who just do other stuff.
I was about to say the only one in the psych department here is Dr. Tatyana. She was called up for literally everything.
Yeah, shoulders so much.
Yeah.
Well, me.
No, but you were barely considered a staff member for a while.
Well, there's a good point here. Yeah.
Ouch.
No, he's right.
It's true. It's hurtful, but it's true.
It's true,
If a university report comes out in 2019 saying your psych department isn't culturally diverse, and then 3 years later you still refuse to do it.
And talking about, students are transient, but also we have our permanent staff members and we have our transient staff members, right? So there's also about how much you can enact change when you're on, as we've been talking at the strike, say, rolling fixed term contracts or unstable work,
or the fact that the people who supposedly have power in departments, the heads of certain programs, even just the head of the school, the fact that cycles around every few years means that that person doesn't have to really have an agenda or do anything, because these aren't permanent positions. You know that in a few years, when your term is done, you go back to being at the same level. And if you're the one who asserted your power, now you've created bad blood with the rest of the department if no one else has been doing that. And so it's kind of like our stalemate of who's going to actually do something, but then also potentially sour their working relationships with people for being this person who finally stood up.
Or the time it takes to get those in motion in such a bureaucratic system, and then the terms only being 3 years, right? You might start something with really good intentions, but will the next person follow it through?
I was just going to say, also the emotional labour that's attached with that kind of stuff, because, there have been certain things that I haven't wanted to touch with a barge pole, which I would have done in the past, because I know the sort of emotional labour that will be attached to sort of pushing certain things by myself. this isn't sort of related to this, but it is quite hard if you're trying to advocate for your own community, and you're the only person, and so it makes sense that some people might not want to do that, because like you're having to work 40 hours and then advocate for your community as well.
Well, and then it also puts you in that unsafe position. We talked a little bit about that earlier, about maybe some of these staff members aren't wanting to come out because that does potentially put a target on their back. And that's true for the students as well. And I know for me personally, part of why I do push as much as I do, even though I am just an honors student and I don't really have any power anywhere.
So far.
PhD, hopefully, is that because I come from that older generation, I feel almost a little bit of a burden to kind of show that this is the path forward, that it is a safe space for people who are younger than me to do these, that someone needs to advocate, because if we all don't and continue to be the polite Kiwis that some of you are, that change doesn't happen.
Yeah, I definitely agree that we do need very annoying people like Lee to kind of spearhead the charge a little bit. Like, I know that I would actually be quite personally insulted if I was suddenly tasked with being, you know, the queer neuroscientist, or, you know, I would be very like, okay, you know, you're reducing me to one facet of my identity, but, you know, maybe it doesn't sound like you're actually valuing me for the work that I've done. So I absolutely agree with Maggie that I couldn't shoulder that emotional toil. You know, I identify as a coward, and I'm not willing to change that. So I think, like, people who, you know, for, like, you know, you brought up this issue of this turnover, right, of responsibility. But I think all it takes is one very well-meaning, annoying person to really get things in motion. And I think someone who kind of can do enough in, you know, maybe a short tenure as head of school or a high-ranking staff member, that the next person kind of almost cannot overturn it. You know, like, you do need someone to constantly be pushing. It's kind of not enough to suggest an idea and hope that other people kind of commit the same energy that you might be willing to put in. You know, because I'm certainly not. You know, I would love to see more, like, queer representation in the school, but I think it definitely needs to be collective for most people. Like we've seen with the tutor strikes, the tertiary union strikes. You know, for my entire degree, before undergrad, postgrad, before, you know, I was a tutor myself, I've been hearing about poor pay and conditions for tutors and other staff members. But now that the tertiary union's done something, everyone's come together. You know, I think that would be something similar would be really valuable in our school. And I think the queer panel was a really good step forward. I think that was a really good idea.
But now we have to keep up with it. We can't just do it the one time because it was Pride Month and now we're good.
It wasn't
Conversation.
And that's why it's university designated Pride Month.
BUW Pride Month.
Oh yeah, for people who aren't familiar with the university, which is most listeners, Pride Month at Victoria University is in September as opposed to
June.
But I guess, if anything, you can treat it as 2 Pride Months then in a year, so maybe they're better.
That's like telling a divorced kid that they get 2 Christmases. That's not the same thing.
Go ahead, Maggie.
It was Pride Month, so they shifted Pride in Wellington to then because of COVID and stuff. So usually, because usually it would be in summer.
Yeah.
But
Well,
they
and it makes more sense for New Zealand to maybe have it then, because it's only June because it's summer in the US in June. And we don't have to do everything the US does. I know it's hard for queer people to believe that, but we don't have to do everything Americans do. I give you permission as an American.
Please, can someone tell queer people online this?
Well, one thing, we're 15 minutes in, and we still didn't touch on this, because considering a lot of the audience is international, we should have probably gone over some definitions as well to begin with. For example, what neurodiverse actually is.
Bag's not.
Should we throw the academic under the bus with this question? Well,
This could be a team effort. We'll just...
Yeah. Because I feel we spoke about labels and what they should be, what they shouldn't be, so on and so forth. How probably a good idea to talk for a couple minutes about what these actually are for someone who has no clue.
I guess similar to rainbow terms is it's going to vary sort of person to person. So my understanding of the term will differ from someone else, and there's also the academic term, hence why I was finger gunning at Gloria, the clinical psychologist. But essentially, the way that I use neurodiverse is, I guess, a lot more strengths-based and targeted towards people who have like ADHD or autism. There's a lot of kind of conditions that come under that, but rather than sort of looking at these conditions as something that's wrong with someone, it's more that, they're different, they're diverse, and the same with like a lot of terms. There'll be contention as to whether or not we should use that term because, brains differ with everyone, but this is a term that's used to kind of, well, for me, it's a term that pushes back against that deficit model and just tries to reframe it as, my brain's a bit different.
But also, like, sorry, I was just thinking, the word neurotypical, right? I feel like that it's just normie vibes, like, yeah, it just, I don't know where I wasn't really going anywhere with that. I just, yeah.
It's okay to have that bugbear. I have it too, a little bit. There's a lot of the language that is used within the queer community and within the neurodiverse community at times is either like, it's jargon, it's more jargon than terms, really, or a terminology. I suppose they're one and the same thing, but there's I suppose a slight epistemological difference for me.
Well, and that might be a good way to segue into, even within this, we've been using different words to refer to the queer community. Some of us are saying queer, some are saying rainbow. Some other audience members might be more familiar with LGBT+. There's a lot of different words, and they've continued to change throughout time. When I first started my advocacy work, it was GLBT, before we switched it around because it was a little bit more acknowledging of place of primacy for feminist views. But there is that conversation, and I know some of us have also had that at the Queering Psychology event, talked about how using the term rainbow can feel a little bit like wearing rose-tinted glasses, that it makes it all seem really nice and rosy, and being a queer person is very happy when that isn't our experience all the time, and that we don't need to kind of engage in toxic positivity just because so much of being queer can be difficult.
I was going to say as well, you and I have talked about how it's quite infantilizing, and I think it also centers the focus of very young people who have kind of grown up in a much more accepting environment, and like we've said already, a much more open talking about their identity, and rainbow kind of feels like a term that's designed for queer children rather than queer adults.
Or for straight people. Because for me, it feels very much like a straight comfort thing that it makes...
highly consumable.
That makes cisgendered heteronormative people feel more comfortable. Whereas queer, because it is a reclaimed slur, starts to feel a little bit different to heteronormative audiences.
Well, yeah, when I think rainbow, I think Teletubbies. And, I mean, I think it... Like, I've said this to you as well before, that it implies that a rainbow researcher kind of makes me feel like it's implying that I'm going to be a lovely person, a very nice person, and I think that that's like...
And then they
that's
meet
not
you,
the case
and
for me.
then...
I am insufferable. But I think it's also, that there's not... Queer people don't have to be your friend. Queer people don't have to be nice. Queer people are people. Like, we're not this, like... it just makes me think of like, puppet shows, like trying to explain what queerness is to children. Oh, I'm like, I'm a rainbow researcher. I'm like, oh, fuck off, like just say these are, like I'm an adult. There are many queer people who are much older than me. And I think it does feel infantilizing that we can't have conversations about queerness using terms that sound adult, you know.
I guess it sort of ties back to what I was talking about with emotional energy, because I definitely cycle through terms depending on the audience. So, like, if I was talking to someone within the rainbow community that had an in-depth understanding of terms, then I'd probably say that I'm, like, polysexual. But most people usually don't know what that means, so I'll use queer. But, like, you don't want to have to constantly break down different terms and what they mean, and you just want to have, like, a conversation with people. And so I find, like, rainbow can be helpful for, I guess, like, mitigating that when you're having a conversation with people that perhaps don't fully understand. But, like, if they want to learn more about terms, then that's a different thing. But it's just...
Well, but at the same time, rainbow, that kind of what we're talking about, comes from this newer generation. So it is actually an incredibly new term. If you wanted to have something that somebody's going to more likely understand, LGBT is the one that's been around the longest and most people would understand. Because I run into that when I've said the rainbow community. People are like, so wait, is that gay people? And I have to backtrack and explain it.
Tatyana, you must have, because you use an acronym to talk about Pasifika identities.
Yes, yeah, I did. So the acronym is MVPFAFF+, and that was, coined by Felicia Brown-Acton, who's, like, this amazing Fakafifine community activist. And so within the Moana, within Pasifika, there are, these kind of gender diverse identities across each island. So, and it's... Yeah, I think that the identities are kind of changing now. Like they're meaning different things to different people, but it's kind of like people who are women, but they were, like, born in, like, they were assigned male at birth, but kind of fulfill these like cultural roles within their families, which are, I think, interestingly, and it's just something to, I guess, park, is that they are quite gendered, the roles that like in Tonga, people would be called Fakaleiti. So if we just go through, so the M is like Mahu, and that's Hawaii. Vaka lewa, that's Fijian. I think it's Palopa, which is in Papua New Guinea. And then Fakaleiti, Tongan Akava'ine is in the Cook Islands, Fakafifine, Samoa, Fakafifine, and Niue, and then there's the kind of plus. So I think it's interesting that across each islands there's this kind of similar, it's like kind of like a similar identity, but of course there are, like, differences between.
I appreciate, too, that within that, because it has become an acronym, that each one has their place and has their honor. Whereas over in the U.S., all of them fall under this two-spirit umbrella. And that idea of a two-spirit person is actually very specific to very certain tribes. But we're using one term is being used to refer to, cultures as disparate as, like, the Inuits and the Aztecs. Like, you're subsuming all these people together and just trying to use one label for all of them. So it's... You can have arguments, too, about reducing people down to a letter. But at least I appreciate that they get to have a letter.
Coming back to your point about reclaimed terms as well, like, this is something that I think about as somebody who's not in the community, is, like, who gets to reclaim terms. Because I guess, like, for you as a queer person, you can go, hey, this is how I describe myself, and so I want you to respect that. But if you're not using words to describe yourself, right, and there's going to be that huge diversity in how people want to be described or what words they feel comfortable with you using, I think that's maybe part of the reason we use rainbow so much, is it maybe is the most palatable. Not everybody likes it, but maybe it's the one that's the least bad of all the options.
It does seem to be mostly a New Zealand thing, though, as well. Because if you look at the literature, queer or LGBT is, again, more common.
And I do think that comes down to a lot of people not feeling great about straight cis people using queer as a reclaimed term,
Yep.
or people who still, where that brings up a lot of hurt as it being a slur. And so, I guess from like a positioning perspective, who gets to use what word? And,
I mean, I have a life outside of academia, and may shock the listeners. I work in a pie shop as well, and the majority of our customers are tradies. So people who work in construction, builders, council workers, the like, and the word that they feel most comfortable using to talk about my identity is dyke, and that's in most Western cultures considered a slur, and it's taken me quite a long time to not really care about it, with partially because of the help of supportive friends I've met and my partner who's lovely, but that's like that's a term I'm now okay using for myself, but I have met other queer people who have no qualms addressing other lesbians or gay people with words like dyke or they're and those
Well, to
like
the point that you even like kind of whisper that one. That one's definitely much more contentious.
Yeah,
like I can't. That one was used so much against me. Again, having grown up more 90s, early thousands, when this stuff was just barely starting to be sort of kind of accepted, and that was very much still a slur. Whereas queer for me, I think that was a slur maybe about a half step above my generation. I never got that thrown at me as a slur.
I would have thought it would be before your generation.
That's what I'm saying. Sorry, when I say above, I went backwards in time. Sorry.
Right.
But yeah, so that would have been maybe more of a Gen X issue, whereas I'm fairly firmly a millennial. The F slur was used a lot more. Dyke is a harder one. I've kind of gone through a similar journey of being slightly more comfortable with that. But yeah, and maybe this is why it's such a nebulous space to work in, is the language changes on a dime. Yeah. Words that we might have published in papers 2 years ago are not how we talk about it anymore.
Or people are comfortable, people say rainbow in their writing and dyke in their jokes, and there's this disconnect between talking face to face with queer people and having to take accountability and responsibility for the way that your words reach people versus optics,
When you used the word dyke, I sort of reflected in myself, like I had a visceral reaction to you using that term. No, you shouldn't apologise. It's just I can't really ever think of a time recently that I've heard it being used, and because I guess a few people, I've only heard it being used negatively, but that's the whole thing about sort of reclaiming terms and the diversity in the way that like terms are used, and I just thought it was interesting that I had such a visceral reaction, whereas like I guess the F word I hear a lot more often, and it seems I guess like I've become desensitized to it almost, purely because like I hear it being used in drag culture and stuff. But yeah, just sort of reflecting on what terms people use and what's okay and what's not, and
which highlights the whole point of this conversation is that you can't tell what experiences people have had with different terms, and so assuming that a term has been reclaimed in quotation marks or normalized kind of is very, it's quite dicey. Like it is a bit of a minefield, I think, and especially once you take in a cultural perspective of what words are, kind of, I guess, palatable to foreigners or outsiders versus
and
people
it might
inside.
also kind of shed some light on why there's a bit of a silence about this in universities and in places like the School of Psychology, is that, coming back to one of my earlier points, like academics are used to being the all-knowing one in the room, and used to being the people that know stuff. And if we are thinking about supposedly our Vic values, right? Like ako isn't just about learning and teaching, it's like the reciprocal communication of information, right? So we should be learning as much from our students as we're teaching them. But do all academics feel comfy with that idea of potentially trying something out, getting it wrong, trying it again? Or is there that thing of we stay away from the things we don't know about because we want to be the educated one in the room?
I do think that there's as well, maybe now more than ever. Actually, no, perhaps that's not true. I think, you always have kind of young queer people that have much less patience for people getting it wrong. And especially now in our kind of ultra-connected, like, digital age where there's so much kind of communication between queer communities all over the world. I think there is a lot more pressure on not just academics, but everyone to get it right the first time, because if they don't, it'll be, a spotlight is kind of placed on them, which isn't, as I think there's more as a community that we could do to kind of encourage people to try and fail rather than not try at all, I suppose. Just speaking, hearing about some of, our colleagues and classmates have labelled some academics as outright homophobes because they've used incorrect language or they've been maybe insensitive about something, and so that's kind of been enough to label them almost an enemy, which is so unfair,
Well, I literally made a mistake at the very start of this podcast.
Yeah, and that doesn't make you a bad person. And I think part of it is, as so queer people...
So here's a bad person. No,
But what I'm trying to get across is, like, a lot of it comes from intention. You can tell usually what someone's intent is. So I mentioned earlier a lecturer who asked me what pronouns were, but I knew that person really did have a really good heart and really good intention, has put in the work to make that better over the time I've known them. But when you just get that first email, it's the first time you've ever really spoken to someone, you don't know how that conversation's about to go. And then as a student, that's a lot to put on you, and you don't know how to educate them. And so this kind of reciprocal nature of the academic needing to learn as much as they're teaching, the student doesn't know where that power dynamic lays. This person's ultimately in charge of my grades, which is in charge of my degree, which is in charge of my career, and you never know how to navigate the safety of those situations. In my case, I pivoted and I was like, here, talk to Liam Bloomfield. He's the rainbow advisor for the school. He will help you.
And I do think it's on academics to create, like you say, you can't just kind of share or be vulnerable with lecturers or academic staff if they haven't already made it a safe place to do so. And so I think that's also us as teachers going, how do I create the kind of space and class and lab and research environment where if I get it wrong, you can come and tell me. And like, I can think of instances of going to people who have been, bosses or supervisors and going, hey, you said that and that wasn't okay and here's why, and then being like mortified that they did that and being really apologetic and then doing lots of work to fix that. But you wouldn't go and say that to somebody if you didn't feel like they would listen, right?
True.
Yeah.
And then part of it too is we're talking about younger people who are so new in their identities that you don't necessarily have the comfort or the security in how you're identifying, how you're expressing yourself to go around and turn around to correct people. You just would rather cancel them to avoid the confrontation, or just be like, nope, that person got it wrong, thus they must not be an ally. And that's something that I've kind of struggled with in different spaces, of having that perspective of these things take time, but then encountering people who are like, how are they doing this in 2020? I was like, you do know that some of these identities didn't exist 5 years ago.
And it has to be said that most academics live under a rock, and that, you just need to politely tell them when they crawl out occasionally from under it that, maybe it's just something they've never been exposed to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
With everything you guys have said then, we ask this question to everybody who comes on, and it's usually the last question, and I'll ask it, and then you guys can go whichever way you want with it. If you could leave us with one piece of advice, what would it be? Now, this can be targeted towards any group, anything, whichever way you'd like to take it, towards students, towards people within your community, of other communities, whichever way you want to go with it. But if you guys want to do that for the last 5-10 minutes, and we can end there.
All right. Okay. I think my advice would be condensed for everyone listening to this podcast, academic, staff, student, stranger, into 2 words, and that is chill out. Not everything is very serious. Not everything is life or death. Things will change. People will change. Don't expect the most of everyone or anyone. Just chill out. Sometimes it's not your problem. Sometimes it's not your fault. And just be okay with that. Don't worry about it. Chill out.
You're such a Kiwi.
She'll be right.
She'll be right.
I'm actually going to go the other direction, which is if you want to see change, be the change. You can't expect someone else to stand up. You can't expect someone else to do it for you. And to not speak up, to not say something, to not change things only benefits the status quo.
Okay, don't be chill about everything.
Now you can kind of do both at the same time. You can pick and choose your battles. There's some things which I feel you should stand up for, and other things you should be able to realize that probably the intent didn't necessarily have any malice in it. And
Well, but even if there's no malice, still correcting someone, not just letting them do the wrong thing, because they aren't going to know.
Yeah.
I think in general, maybe it's just about questioning, like, why things are the way they are. And that's such a vague thing, but I just mean, like, you know, those kinds of thoughts, like you might see something happening, you're like, oh my gosh, like you have this automatic thought. And I think it's kind of like stepping back and being like, oh, like, why did I think that? Or why do I do these, like, I guess it's just kind of, like kind of reflecting. And like, I think in general, like I've seen it with a lot of my friends lately, is just like being able to be gentle with yourself and like don't put so much pressure on so this is the chilling out coming through. Yeah. Yeah, you know, like, yes, you can treat yourself, yes, you can have rest. Like, I think we're in such a world that we have a lot of internalized, capitalist values. So I think it's, and that, revolves around things like productivity and like, you're like, I place this value on myself because I can do this for other people, or I achieve these things. And I think it's just stepping back and being like, I was going to say touch some grass. I mean, that's...
I guess similar to what you were saying, and I'm going to hit you with a whole bunch of sayings, or 2. So the first one, which was sort of drilled into me when I was volunteering at Youthline, and it's probably used elsewhere as well, is like putting on your own oxygen mask before others, because like I know there's a lot of people who want to push for change, but you can do the most good by looking after yourself first, before kind of stepping into that, if you have the capacity to do that. I know in some situations it's not that easy, and kind of what you were saying, Sahir, about like picking your battles, because I had a conversation with someone in the lab about kind of the stuff that we'll put our energy into. Like for me it's sort of trying to push for change in like ADHD research, but in other spaces perhaps I don't have the emotional capacity to push for that, but I'll support others, and I think it's just about looking after yourself and managing that energy.
Awesome. And last but not least,
I love this idea of gentleness. I think, gentleness with yourself and making sure that you are getting enough rest and that you do stuff that's nice. And gentleness with others, that usually other people being who they are and doing what they want doesn't actually threaten you. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. People get really worried about what it means for other people to be doing this and doing that. But if they're not hurting anyone, then I think the chilling out advice is a goodie.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for coming on. Thank you, Gloria, Maggie, Tatyana, Lee, and Claire. And thanks everyone for listening. If anybody wanted to give their contacts, if people wanted to get in contact with them, for help, would you guys be open to me putting that on the show notes or the podcast notes?
Yeah.
Tatyana?
Yes.
Yes, know something.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
awesome, yeah, because they can get in touch with your research and the fact that your voices will be out there. Thanks, guys. And until next time, take everything seriously. Don't take anything seriously.
Gentle
But
and chill
most
out.
importantly, be gentle with yourself.
Yo.
All right. Thanks.
Sage.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yes.